What was it like having her in your arms?
Oh, it was just so sweet. There were times, I'm going to admit, there were times it was frustrating because I'd be trying to lead a class and teach, and she'd kind of be in the way or doing things, squirming. I'd say, "You quit being a squirmy tail." And she's just moving around all the time. So there were times it was frustrating, but I loved it. I loved it. And now looking back, I'd do anything for another day with my little squirmy tail girl in my arms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When 5-year-old Summer Wells vanished on June 15, 2021, her mother didn't call a neighbor or a relative first. She called the child's church teacher. Between 6:30 and 7 p.m., Candus Bly placed 5 Facetime calls to Robin Lane. The same time investigators later logged as the 911 window. That overlap has never been clarified. Robin was at her daughter's dance rehearsal, unaware that those missed calls would make her the first outsider tied to the case. When she finally saw the messages, she rushed to Ben Hill Road and discovered something even stranger. Some officers searching for Summer hadn't yet seen the girl's picture. The first photo they used came from Robin's phone. If her recollection is correct, then the official timeline isn't just incomplete, it might be wrong. Robin Lane remembers the evening clearly, not because of what she saw, but because of what she missed. While taking photos at her daughter's dance rehearsal, her phone began to light up again and again. When she finally looked down, she saw the name on the screen, Candus Bly. 5 Facetime calls, one after another, between 6:30 and 7 o'clock. She didn't know it then, but that same window of time would later appear in official records as the moment Candus dialed 911 to report 5-year-old Summer Wells missing. When Robin finally returned the call, Candus appeared on screen crying, her voice shaking. "Summer's gone," she said. "I called the police. I don't know what to do." It sounded like panic, pure and unfiltered, but it also raised a question investigators never fully answered. If Candus had already called the police, why was she still trying to reach Robin? And if those FaceTime calls came before 911, then the report to law enforcement came later than claimed. The two timelines overlap, but they don't align. In a case built on minutes, that single overlap could alter everything. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's statement placed the 911 call at 6:30 p.m., Robin's account, given in July 2021 to retired homicide detective Chris McDonough on the interview room, places multiple FaceTime attempts during that same period. Unless Candus made those calls simultaneously, one of the records is off, by minutes, maybe more. In child abductions, those minutes are not trivial. They define the moment the child was last seen, the start of the search radius, and the possible movement of any suspect or witness. Why did Candus call the church teacher first? Robin's bond with Summer was not casual. Each week, the little girl ran to her arms at church, clinging to her during songs and lessons. She just wanted to be loved, Robin said. That simple observation, repeated in several interviews, reflects more than affection. It explains instinct. In moments of crisis, people often reach for whoever feels emotionally safe. For Candus, that wasn't a family member or a neighbor. It was the woman her daughter trusted most. There is also the nature of the call itself. FaceTime isn't just communication, it's display. It allows the caller to be seen, to show emotion, to prove distress. When Candus placed those calls, she may have been searching for validation, for someone to witness her panic and confirm it was real. In crisis psychology, this is called a mirror response, a way for the mind to process shock through another person's eyes. It does not indicate guilt, but it reveals the chaos of the moment. Still, it also means that instead of focusing on coordination or immediate search, Candus was reaching outward, looking for emotional connection. When Robin hung up, she didn't hesitate. She went home, packed flashlights, snacks, and batteries, and drove to Ben Hill Road. She arrived around 9 o'clock, roughly 2.5 hours after the calls. The scene that greeted her was chaotic: yellow tape, flashing lights, police vehicles lining the dirt road, helicopters overhead. The stillness of Beach Creek had been replaced by confusion and noise. Robin parked at the bottom of the hill and walked up, ready to help. But what she encountered next changed her understanding of the night entirely. When she spoke to officers at the scene, some admitted they hadn't yet seen a photo of the missing child. Others said they had. To Robin, that made no sense. How could an organized search begin without a unified image of the girl they were looking for? She opened her phone and showed them one of her own pictures. Summer smiling in a bright dress, her short hair shining under the church lights. According to Robin, that image became the first visual reference used that night. It's a small detail, but it matters. Without a current photo, descriptions vary, memory falters, and false sightings multiply. Taken together, Robin's account exposes two cracks that formed in the very first hours of the investigation. One was a time gap, the unresolved overlap between the Facetime calls and the official 911 log. The other was a communication gap, the lack of consistent information among first responders. Neither is speculation. Both are verifiable procedural weaknesses. And in missing child cases, those weaknesses often shape the outcome. If the Facetime calls came before 911, then there was a delay in initiating the emergency response, minutes lost that could have been spent searching. If they came after, then the calls reflect a mother's inability to process what was happening, cycling between police and trusted contacts for reassurance. Either version carries investigative value. The timestamps, if retrieved from phone records, could confirm which sequence is true. Robin's testimony does not accuse, but it clarifies. It offers an independent account from someone outside the family, someone who can mark the beginning of the public timeline. In a case where speculation has drowned facts, her words reintroduce something measurable: time, sequence, and communication. To this day, law enforcement has never commented on those Facetime calls or whether they were reviewed. They remain an overlooked key in the earliest hour of the case, the hour that determines everything that follows. Robin Lane's account is not dramatic, but it is precise. 5 calls, 1 photo, 2 hours, and inside those numbers lies the first fracture in the story of Summer Wells. In her July 2021 interview on The Interview Room, Robin Lane confirmed a detail that exposed a serious procedural failure in the early response to Summer Wells' disappearance. When she arrived at Ben Hill Road around 9 p.m., nearly 3 hours after the 911 call, she asked officers if they had a picture of the missing child. According to Robin, some of them said they hadn't seen one yet. She then unlocked her phone and showed a photo she had taken of Summer during Sabbath school. That image, she said, was the one officers looked at that night. This statement, though brief, carries major investigative weight. If accurate, it means that for several hours after the disappearance was reported, search personnel were not working with a confirmed visual reference of the child. In missing child operations, that represents a communication failure between command and the field. By standard procedure, a child's photo should move from the initial 911 dispatch through the law enforcement chain immediately, reaching all officers, search teams, and volunteers before the first ground sweeps begin. If even one group of responders lacked that photo, it indicates a breakdown in coordination during the most critical phase of the search. Robin's account, therefore, establishes what investigators call an initial response gap, the measurable period between notification and full operational alignment. The presence of this gap explains why early efforts appeared disorganized despite massive manpower. It also aligns with public reports at the time describing helicopters, roadblocks, and volunteer units mobilized rapidly but without consistent direction. This failure is procedural, not emotional. It's not about who cared or who didn't, it's about how information traveled. The missing photo suggests that communication from Hawkins County Dispatch to on-scene officers and secondary agencies was not synchronized. Either the image was not distributed fast enough, or it failed to transmit through internal networks used by law enforcement and rescue teams. In both cases, the consequence is the same. Responders were searching without a unified description of the child's face. The investigative implications are significant. Without a shared image, responders depend on verbal descriptions: 5 years old, blonde hair, short haircut, which can easily produce misidentifications and false leads. It also means the first hours of witness canvassing relied on varying recollections of Summer's appearance. That inconsistency can distort timelines, complicate sighting reports, and weaken early evidence collection. Robin's statement is not speculation, It's direct testimony from a civilian at the scene. Its value lies in what it objectively reveals. The search communication structure did not meet standard readiness by the 3-hour mark. This fact supports broader patterns observed in similar cases where speed of response outpaces clarity of coordination. The emotional urgency to act overtakes the logistical need to organize, producing exactly what Robin described: movement without alignment. From a systems perspective, her observation identifies the point at which the investigation began to fracture. The 911 call at 6:30 p.m. activated multiple jurisdictions, local deputies, state investigators, and rescue volunteers. Within that multi-agency framework, small delays compound quickly. A dispatcher missing an attachment, an officer leaving before the image upload completes, a volunteer briefed verbally instead of visually. Each is minor on its own, but collectively they create the very disorder Robin witnessed. Her testimony also explains why the first verified public image of Summer, the smiling church photo released by authorities, matches the one Robin described. It suggests her photo may have served as the base image circulated to news outlets within 24 hours. If so, the teacher who answered late became the first person to provide law enforcement with an accurate visual of the missing child. The fact that a civilian had to fill that role underscores the structural weakness of early coordination. It's not a criticism of the officers who responded, but a documentation of sequence: a call, a report, a partial relay, and a visual confirmation that came from outside the chain of command. That sequence should never occur in a missing child case. Yet it did here, and it explains why the early hours produced little verifiable progress, despite the scale of the search. In the analytical view, Robin Lane's simple act of showing a photograph is not an emotional anecdote. It's a measurable data point. It identifies the first confirmed instance of information lag in the Summer Wells investigation. It clarifies why the first phase of the search, though rapid and resource-heavy, yielded no immediate results. And it illustrates how even a well-intentioned, high-speed mobilization can lose effectiveness when internal communication falters. By providing that image, Robin unknowingly corrected an operational blind spot that should have been addressed long before she arrived. Her statement, therefore, doesn't just document what happened. It defines where the process failed. The search didn't begin in confusion because people didn't care. It began that way because, for hours, the most basic piece of information, a face, was missing from the system designed to find it. Among the details that fueled the first weeks of the Summer Wells investigation, none spread faster or proved more misleading than the story of the red truck. Within days of the child's disappearance, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation released a bulletin describing a 1998 to 2000 red Toyota Tacoma with white buckets in the bed and a ladder rack. The driver, the agency said, was a potential witness who might have been seen in the Beach Creek area on the day Summer vanished. It wasn't labeled as a suspect vehicle, but the wording was enough to ignite speculation across Tennessee. Almost overnight, the red truck became a symbol of the unknown. Local residents began photographing similar trucks on rural roads, posting them online, and calling law enforcement with leads. Social media flooded with side-by-side comparisons of vehicles, license plate numbers, and blurry screenshots. The story traveled far beyond Hawkins County, drawing attention from other states and even international followers of true crime forums. The truck transformed from a witness tip into a full-fledged suspect in the public mind. But in her interview on The Interview Room, Robin Lane quietly dismantled the myth. When Chris McDonough asked about the truck, she didn't hesitate. "That red truck has already been eliminated," she said. The statement was simple, definitive, and, importantly, based on what she had been told by investigators after the initial search. Her phrasing confirmed that the truck had been checked, the driver identified, and the lead closed. By the time she knew that, however, thousands of people had already been looking for it. Robin's comment provides a crucial timeline marker. It places her knowledge of the truck's elimination after the public campaign to find it. That timing matters because it exposes how slow the flow of official updates was during the first phase of the investigation. The TBI's initial call for information on the vehicle went out on June 16, 2021, less than 24 hours after Summer was reported missing. For weeks afterward, the agency repeated the same description in press releases, saying they were still seeking the driver. But by the time Robin gave her interview in July, she was already aware that the vehicle had been ruled out. That means the correction reached civilians close to the family before it reached the broader public. This lag represents another kind of communication gap, one that sits not inside the investigation, but between the investigation and the community. In law enforcement terms, it's called an information asymmetry, a delay in updating the public once a lead is verified or dismissed. These delays can happen for valid reasons. Investigators might withhold details to protect privacy, avoid tipping off potential suspects, or wait for written confirmation. But in high-profile missing child cases, information asymmetry can have unintended effects. It keeps the public chasing a dead lead long after investigators have moved on. That's exactly what happened here. For nearly 2 months, people continued submitting photos of red trucks to law enforcement hotlines. Some drivers were stopped or questioned based solely on color and model. News outlets repeated the description long after it was no longer relevant. Even as late as August 2021, online forums debated whether the truck was connected to a potential abduction. Yet, according to Robin, the vehicle had been ruled out early on. The reason her statement carries weight is because of who she is within the case's timeline. Robin was not a rumor source. She was in contact with both the Wells family and the local church community, and she had spoken directly with investigators in the days following the disappearance. Her information about the red truck's elimination is consistent with what the TBI later confirmed months afterward, that the driver had been identified and was not linked to Summer's disappearance. The delay between those two confirmations, the internal one known to Robin and the external one shared publicly, illustrates how the investigation lost control of its narrative. Once the red truck theory reached social media, it became nearly impossible to retract. The more time passed without an official update, the more people assumed the silence meant validation. In reality, it meant nothing could be shared until the lead was fully processed. From an analytical perspective, this is an example of a media echo loop, where the absence of new information reinforces the perceived truth of old information. Every time the TBI reiterated the same call for tips without an accompanying correction, it amplified the impression that the truck was still central. Meanwhile, insiders like Robin already knew it wasn't. That split created two parallel versions of the investigation, one unfolding quietly within law enforcement, and one exploding noisily online. The investigative consequence of that split is more than reputational. It affects data. When hundreds of citizens report sightings of red trucks, dispatch systems and tip lines become flooded. Genuine leads, unrelated to the vehicle, get buried beneath volume. Analysts then spend time verifying false submissions, diluting resources that should be focused elsewhere. In retrospect, this was one of the first major, false lead waves in the Summer Wells case. And Robin's remark identifies when that wave began to recede internally even as it continued publicly. Her comment also helps define a chronological boundary in the case's information timeline. The initial truck advisory marks the start of public participation. The quiet elimination marks the start of public confusion. Together, they illustrate how an early investigation can fracture when information is released faster than it can be verified. When Robin said, "That red truck has been eliminated," she was, intentionally or not, recording the moment those two currents diverged. For forensic investigators reviewing the case today, the red truck episode serves as a case study in information management failure. A single premature lead, once publicized, cannot easily be undone. Even after the TBI clarified the matter later that year, digital traces of the theory remained, screenshots, news articles, and videos still treating the vehicle as potential evidence. In effect, the misinformation outlived the truth. Robin's straightforward answer to McDonough, just 7 words, cut through months of speculation. That red truck has already been eliminated. The value of that line isn't emotional, it's structural. It documents when certain information reached the inner circle around the family compared to when it reached the public. And it reveals that the delay between the two allowed an entire false narrative to take hold. In a case as scrutinized as Summer Wells, small miscommunications can alter the course of both the investigation and public perception. The red truck lead wasn't a lie, it was a fragment of truth released too soon. Once it entered the public sphere without closure, it became a distraction powerful enough to overshadow more critical lines of inquiry. By tracing when and how Robin learned the truck was eliminated, investigators can pinpoint one of the earliest media blind spots in the case, the point where official information stopped keeping pace with public expectation. That gap didn't just confuse the community, it redefined the investigation's direction. For weeks, attention stayed fixed on a vehicle that no longer mattered, while the real question, what actually happened on that hill, remained unanswered. In her interview, Robin Lane recalled a small but telling conversation with Candus Bly, the kind of detail that seemed harmless at first but later became significant. When asked about Summer's short hair in the photos circulating online, Robin said she had asked Candus directly why her daughter's hair had been cut so close to the scalp. Candus replied casually, "It was a cool summer cut." That phrase, simple, almost dismissive, has become one of the few confirmed explanations for Summer's sudden change in appearance. Robin's recollection matters, because it provides both a date and a context. She first saw the haircut around Mother's Day, 2021, roughly a month before Summer was reported missing. The timing is verifiable through photos taken at the Seventh-day Adventist Church, where Summer attended Sabbath school each weekend. Robin said Mother's Day was the first time I saw her with her hair cut, placing the change in early to mid-May. From a factual standpoint, this creates a clear visual marker. Every known photograph of Summer shared publicly, whether by the family, local news, or investigators, shows her with that same short haircut. No image has surfaced showing her hair grown out beyond that point. That means the last verifiable image of Summer was captured in, or around mid-May 2021, several weeks before her disappearance on June 15th. Between those two dates lies what investigators refer to as an image gap, a period where no confirmed photographs or videos of the child exist. In missing child investigations, such gaps are not minor. They define the window of last confirmed public visibility. When no one outside the family can verify seeing or photographing a child for weeks prior to disappearance, it raises procedural questions. Was the child attending school, church, or other activities during that time? Were there witnesses who can confirm her condition and appearance? Or did her public presence simply narrow to the home environment? Robin's testimony helps establish the boundary of that gap. She saw Summer with the new haircut on Mother's Day, and continued to see her at church in the following weeks. But even she could not recall precisely when she last saw the girl before June 15th. In her own words, "I'd have to look at my pictures because I take photos all the time." That uncertainty underscores how quickly routine attendance blurred into absence. Investigators working from photographic timelines treat such gaps as both a limitation and a clue. The limitation is obvious. Without recent images, it's difficult to determine whether a child's physical condition changed in the weeks leading up to the event. The clue lies in the pattern, why the public imagery stops when it does. In Summer's case, the most recent set of photos released by the family, including the widely circulated milk jug photo and several short clips from TikTok, all date from the same general period, late spring 2021, close to the haircut. None show her in June. Robin's observation of the haircut, therefore, does more than describe appearance. It marks the last known visual checkpoint before the trail goes dark. It confirms that the short-haired image of Summer, bright dress, cropped blonde hair, represents her final verified look before she vanished. The significance is investigative, not emotional. It establishes the end of public visibility and the start of the unverified period leading up to the 911 call. The haircut itself also plays a secondary role in timeline alignment. Because Candus described it as a cool summer cut, she positioned it as a seasonal decision, something done for comfort as the weather warmed. In forensic interviews, such context can be used to confirm or challenge chronology. When a parent's reasoning aligns with external conditions, early May heat. What Robin's testimony confirms is that the haircut was normal, not symbolic or disciplinary. as some online speculation claimed. There was no indication of injury or concealment. The haircut merely provides an anchor point, a clear physical change that coincides with the last wave of photographs taken before the disappearance. It's the kind of small, verifiable milestone that investigators use to map certainty inside uncertainty. However, the lack of any confirmed images after mid-May introduces a broader issue in how the case was documented. In most investigations, law enforcement establishes a verified last known photo and compares it against witness accounts to ensure the image matches the child's final condition. In this case, the public release of only pre-June images means the investigation had to rely on older references when distributing missing posters. If Summer's appearance had changed even slightly, sunburn, bruises, longer hair, those posters wouldn't reflect it. That's what makes Robin's information so valuable. By identifying the haircut's timing and confirming it as early May, she effectively locked the image used on all official materials to that date. Her statement clarified why every search poster, press release, and broadcast used the same photo, because it was the last reliable one. The haircut, then, is more than a style choice. It's a timestamp. It anchors the final phase of Summer's public life and outlines the void that followed. Between that cool summer cut in May and the night of June 15th, there is a gap of roughly 4 weeks where no confirmed third-party image, video, or appearance exists. For investigators, that 4-week span remains one of the most opaque segments of the timeline. Robin Lane's recollection provides the boundary that allows it to be measured. It tells us when the camera last caught Summer Wells, in a verifiable moment of ordinary life, and how after that, the picture went silent. Robin Lane mentioned something investigators often pay close attention to: the absence of contact before a crisis. She told the interview room that before the evening of June 15th, the day Summer Wells disappeared, she hadn't spoken with Candus Bly for quite some time. The last exchange she remembered was weeks earlier, possibly connected to church events or Summer's attendance at Sabbath school. "I hadn't talked to her," Robin said plainly. "That day was the first time in a while that I'd heard from Candus." This short statement outlines one of the most important behavioral shifts in the timeline. The Wells family, once regular participants at the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Kingsport, had gradually reduced their contact with the congregation. In the months leading up to the disappearance, Robin noted that their attendance became inconsistent and communication grew infrequent. Don Wells was known to be a baptized Adventist, but Candus was less active. Robin recalled that while the family used to arrive on time for Sabbath school, they eventually began missing weeks at a time. No one in the church thought much of it at first. Families drift in and out, especially in rural congregations, but in retrospect, the change stands out. This withdrawal from community life may not seem unusual on its own, but in investigative analysis, such shifts are often categorized under pre-incident behavioral change. It refers to any alteration in a family's routine, relationships, or engagement patterns that occur shortly before a critical event. In the Wells case, that change was silence. The family had effectively stepped back from one of their few external social environments, limiting outside observation of their daily life. Robin's account fills in the social context of that silence. She had not seen or heard from Candus in the days, and possibly weeks, before June 15th. That means that the first contact Candus made after this period of isolation came not through church channels or casual conversation. It came as a string of emergency Facetime calls the evening Summer vanished. The contrast between that silence and the sudden urgency of those calls is striking. It suggests that in a moment of panic, Candus reached instinctively for the last connection associated with stability and trust, the teacher her daughter adored. For investigators, this kind of selective reconnection can be meaningful. It implies that Candus did not maintain ongoing relationships with most church members, yet chose Robin specifically when distress struck. That choice highlights how Summer's bond with Robin had also shaped Candus's perception of safety. In practical terms, it means that Robin became the family's last emotional link to the outside world at the moment of crisis. The withdrawal from community life is also traceable through attendance records and public accounts. Church members later confirmed that the Wells family's visits had become sporadic in 2021. Robin herself said she would have to check her own photographs to know the exact date of Summer's last appearance at church. The most recent confirmed occasion was Mother's Day, when Summer gave Robin a small necklace as a gift. After that, there are no verified sightings of Summer in that setting. This aligns with the Midge Gap, established earlier, and reinforces that the family's social visibility declined in the final month. In the Wells case, Robin's description of the pre-incident silence provides a key reference point. She did not call to share news, to plan an event, or to reconnect socially. She called in crisis. That sudden reappearance, after a long pause, magnifies the emotional weight of her actions that day and adds context to her decision-making process under stress. Investigators evaluating pre-incident patterns would consider several potential explanations for this withdrawal. Some are mundane, transportation issues, family workload, or scheduling conflicts. Others may reflect social or emotional strain, tension within the family, embarrassment, or avoidance of questions from fellow congregants. There is no direct evidence of why the Wells family reduced their attendance, and Robin never speculated. What matters is that she documented the change accurately and placed it in time: consistent attendance, gradual reduction, then silence. Robin's recollection also introduces a measurable social dynamic. In small-town environments, church communities often act as informal monitoring systems, noticing stress, fatigue, or unusual behavior among families. When participation stops, that informal safety net disappears. In this case, the absence of contact meant no one outside the Wells property saw Summer regularly after mid-May. By the time the alarm went out, there were no third-party witnesses who could confirm when she was last seen alive. For the investigation, this pre-incident withdrawal has enduring value. It provides a behavioral context for the timeline already established through digital and photographic evidence. It helps explain why external data, new images, sightings, or social interactions stopped appearing in the weeks before June 15th. It also helps define the emotional environment within the Wells household: insular, private, and disconnected from their support network. When Candus finally broke that silence, it was not gradual. It was desperate. 5 FaceTime calls, back-to-back, to the only person she knew outside the family who would answer without judgment. That sudden reconnection marked the end of a long quiet and the beginning of everything that followed. In missing person investigations, silence can be as informative as speech. It tells investigators when the world stopped looking in and when the family stopped letting it. Robin Lane's simple observation, that she hadn't heard from Candus until the night Summer disappeared, does not accuse anyone. It simply defines a pattern: a family turning inward, a community losing contact, and a teacher who became the first voice they called when the quiet finally broke. She discussed a detail that, while easily overlooked, directly counters one of the earliest misconceptions about Summer Wells. In the weeks following the disappearance, online speculation circulated claiming that Summer might have had a developmental delay or a communication disorder, possibly explaining why she could have wandered off or failed to respond if someone called her name. Robin, who interacted with Summer every week in her Sabbath school class, directly refuted those rumors. "I don't think she was autistic," she said firmly. "She could make eye contact. She would talk when she wanted to. She just didn't talk all the time." Robin's choice of words, "I would make her make eye contact with me," became one of the most precise behavioral observations in the entire case. It demonstrates that Summer had both awareness and control over her attention. Robin described how some children in her class could not sit still or maintain focus, but Summer's behavior stood out not because of inability, but because of energy. "She just had energy she couldn't contain," she explained. That difference is critical. It distinguishes between a child struggling to connect and a child who chooses when to engage. From an investigative standpoint, Robin's description provides a first-hand behavioral profile of Summer that aligns more closely with typical, not impaired development. She could make eye contact, follow verbal instructions when she wanted to, and express herself clearly. Robin emphasized that when Summer spoke, she enunciated her words perfectly. "People say she didn't talk." Robin told McDonough. "She did talk. She could say things clearly as day when she wanted to." This observation has direct implications for the case because it challenges an early theory that Summer might have wandered off due to confusion, disorientation, or lack of understanding of danger. If Robin's account is accurate, Summer was capable of interpreting direction, recognizing people, and responding deliberately. The possibility that she simply walked away without responding to her family or neighbors becomes much less likely under that behavioral profile. Robin's account also adds important context to how Summer interacted socially. She wasn't withdrawn or detached, she was selective. During church activities, she often preferred to help with tasks rather than sit through lessons, arranging stickers for memory verses, helping organize papers, or assisting Robin in setting up the classroom. Robin said she allowed it because it was easier to let her help than to make her sit still. That flexibility demonstrates mutual responsiveness between teacher and child. Summer reacted to expectations and Robin adapted to her temperament. Behaviorally, that kind of interaction reflects a child who understands social cues, but asserts her autonomy. In developmental analysis, it's the opposite of detachment. The eye contact detail further confirms that Summer was socially engaged and emotionally expressive, not disconnected from her surroundings. For investigators, this information narrows the range of plausible scenarios explaining her disappearance. The contact test. Robin described functions almost like a diagnostic observation in real time. In early childhood evaluation, consistent reciprocal eye contact is a key indicator of social awareness and communication readiness. A child who can lock eyes, respond to prompting, and adjust behavior based on another's attention demonstrates intact cognitive and emotional function. Robin's remark that she could make her make eye contact indicates not only that Summer was capable of it, but also that she understood what was being asked of her. This counters the online rumor cycle that began shortly after the case went public. On social media and forums, some users speculated that Summer's perceived quietness in photos and videos suggested a communication or developmental issue. Robin's first-hand experience, however, clarifies the misconception. Summer was quiet by choice, not limitation. That distinction reshapes how investigators and the public should interpret her behavior patterns leading up to the disappearance. If Summer had no communication impairment and exhibited selective speech, it suggests a higher level of situational awareness. A child capable of reading social context and choosing when to respond is less likely to follow a stranger or wander without recognizing risk. In missing child analysis, that awareness often differentiates accidental disappearance from abduction or coercion scenarios. A socially attuned child typically resists unfamiliar approaches, especially in environments they perceive as unsafe. Robin's comments also provide insight into how Summer expressed attachment and recognition. She often ran to Robin, hugged her, and physically sought contact during songs and activities. That behavior demonstrates emotional responsiveness and recognition of specific trusted adults. From a forensic psychology perspective, such selective attachment implies that if Summer were approached by someone she didn't know, she would likely react with caution or retreat rather than compliance. Therefore, Robin's observations undermine the wandering child hypothesis. A child who is aware, responsive, and capable of deliberate communication is unlikely to silently walk into danger without a trace. In the language of behavioral profiling, Summer's traits fit a pattern of interactive impulsivity rather than disoriented detachment. She was active and energetic, but grounded in familiar relationships and capable of discerning attention and approval. Robin's testimony also carries a secondary value. It serves as the only independent account of Summer's communicative abilities from outside the family. Because her observations predate the disappearance and come from a controlled environment, the classroom, they carry greater reliability than retrospective interpretations. This means investigators can use her descriptions as a behavioral baseline for evaluating claims about how Summer might have acted on the day she vanished. Robin's direct experience with Summer across repeated, structured interactions gives her words unusual evidentiary weight. She wasn't offering speculation based on rumor or one-time contact. She was describing behavior observed over months. Every detail, from the insistence on eye contact to the description of clear speech, supports the conclusion that Summer Wells was cognitively and socially typical for her age. For investigators, this clarity matters. It defines what kind of child they were searching for, one who could respond, recognize, and resist. It narrows plausible explanations for why she vanished in daylight from a property surrounded by adults and dogs without being seen or heard. It doesn't answer the central mystery, but it removes one of the earliest misconceptions clouding it. Robin Lane's insistence on that simple test, "Look at me, Summer," ends up being more than a classroom anecdote. It is a behavioral fact, recorded before the speculation began. It tells investigators that the child at the center of this case wasn't lost in her own world. She was present, aware, and engaged with the one she knew. Robin Lane provided one of the only first-hand descriptions of Candus Bly's behavior in the first minutes after Summer Wells was reported missing. According to Robin, Candus had attempted to FaceTime her 5 times between 6:30 and 7 p.m., while Robin was photographing her daughter's dance class. When Robin finally returned the call, she was immediately struck by what she saw on the screen. She was freaking out. Robin recalled. She said, "Summer's gone. I called the police. I don't know what to do." That short exchange, recorded in Robin's memory within minutes of the 911 call, represents one of the few uncontested moments in the timeline. Robin's description shows a mother in visible distress, emotional but incoherent. She noted that Candus wasn't calm enough to explain anything, and that she had to reassure her. "I told her I'd come as soon as I got home," Robin said. "I told her to stay calm." This account establishes the first external confirmation of Candus's immediate reaction. It does not indicate deceit or fabrication. Rather, it captures panic in its rawest form, genuine, but without clarity. In the context of crisis analysis, such reactions can be critical. Investigators often examine the earliest moments of communication after a disappearance to assess the spontaneity of emotion. A person who fabricates a crisis typically presents a structured narrative: what happened, when, and how, before expressing emotion. A person in genuine panic often does the opposite. They lead with emotion, not detail. Robin's description fits the latter pattern. Candus's words, "Summer's gone, I called the police," lack specifics about location, sequence, or cause, but they carry the emotional cadence of shock. This early behavioral snapshot has investigative value because it can be compared to later statements made under calmer conditions. If the FaceTime call logs were ever retrieved, investigators could align Candus's tone and timing against the official 911 transcript. The closer the timestamps, the clearer the picture of her mental state at the time of the emergency call. It would allow analysts to determine whether her distress preceded the report or followed it, an important distinction when evaluating sequence of awareness. Robin's recollection also helps define what was not said. Candus did not describe where she had last seen Summer or how she disappeared. She did not mention the hill, the basement, or the garden, details that later became central to the family's account. Instead, her words focused entirely on the absence itself. She's gone. In crisis communication, the omission of detail can either indicate disorientation or selective memory. In this case, Robin's impression leans toward the former. She made no suggestion of calculation or composure. Candus was visibly overwhelmed, unable to form a coherent timeline. From a behavioral psychology perspective, panic of this kind follows predictable physiological patterns. When confronted with sudden loss or threat, the brain's stress response, commonly known as fight or flight, disrupts the ability to structure language. People revert to fragments, repetitions, and declarative statements. "She's gone. I called. I don't know what to do." These are consistent with acute stress reaction rather than deception. Robin's recollection therefore supports the interpretation that Candus's fear in that moment was authentic. However, authenticity of emotion does not equate to accuracy of information. Genuine panic can still distort memory, blur sequence, and introduce gaps that later become discrepancies. Investigators reviewing Robin's account would note that Candus's emotional state, while real, may have limited her ability to convey usable facts. The value of this testimony lies in showing how early confusion shaped the initial narrative that investigators later tried to clarify. Another important feature of Robin's description is her mention of the visual element. This was not a phone call, it was a FaceTime video. Robin could see Candus's face, her movements, and her environment. Though she did not specify the setting in detail, her account of Candus, pacing and crying, provides a visual verification of distress. If that video connection is preserved in any device log, it would constitute a time-stamped visual record of Candus's condition. In cases involving disputed timelines, digital metadata, when a call started, how long it lasted, whether the camera was active, can be as valuable as physical evidence. Robin's reaction during the call also reinforces her credibility. She didn't question Candus or press for explanations. She simply promised to come. "I said I'd be right there, but first I had to take my daughter home," she told McDonough. "I got my flashlight, my snacks, because I thought I'd be out all night." Her recollection of immediate action supports her sincerity and fixes her involvement in the timeline around 7 p.m., the bridge between panic at the Wells property and organized response from outside. For law enforcement, the moment Robin described serves two investigative purposes. First, it provides an emotional baseline for Candus at the point of discovery. The contrast between initial shock and later composure in interviews can indicate how her narrative evolved. Second, it helps assess the temporal proximity between realization and reporting. If Candus's FaceTime calls overlapped with or preceded the 911 call, investigators can evaluate whether the instinct to reach for comfort delayed the instinct to reach for help. That evaluation doesn't imply guilt. It quantifies reaction time, which is essential for building the true chronology of the case. Robin's account, though brief, remains the clearest external description of Candus's behavior in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. It captures the psychological transition between realization and response, the split second where shock becomes action. Every subsequent interview, search, and rumor grew out of that moment of panic. For investigators, the power of this detail lies not in what it proves, but in what it fixes. It documents the emotional temperature of the case at minute zero, a mother crying through a phone screen, repeating the same phrase, unable to explain, and a teacher hearing that cry and preparing to drive into the night. That reaction, preserved in Robin Lane's words, forms the first verified glimpse into how the disappearance of Summer Wells was understood, not by theory, but by witness in real time. During her interview on The Interview Room, Robin Lane emphasized one theme more than any other: compassion without judgment. When asked about how her church reacted to the disappearance of Summer Wells and the scrutiny surrounding the Wells family, Robin's answer was deliberate. "We just pray," she said. "We don't judge. We just want to love them and pray for them." That statement, simple and sincere, describes the dominant attitude within the Seventh-day Adventist congregation that the family attended. But from a sociological perspective, it also reveals one of the least examined elements of the case: the silence of a community that chose empathy over inquiry. Robin explained that within the church, the focus was on support, not suspicion. Members were encouraged to comfort one another and the family rather than speculate. "Nobody said anything ugly to them," she noted. "Everyone just loved that the kids were there." This culture of kindness, deeply rooted in the congregation's values, effectively created what investigators would call a non-confrontational zone. It was a place where difficult questions were rarely asked, and private struggles went largely unspoken. That posture became even more pronounced after Summer's disappearance. Robin said that while the congregation felt the loss deeply, their collective response remained spiritual rather than investigative. "We pray for Summer every week," she told McDonough. "We pray for the family, and we pray for the people who say hurtful things too." Her phrase, "the people who say hurtful things," referred to the growing number of online commentators accusing the Wells parents of neglect or worse. Robin refused to participate in that debate. "I used to call them haters," she said. Now I call them herders. From a human standpoint, this approach reflects genuine faith and restraint. But from an analytical standpoint, it produced a byproduct investigators often encounter in close-knit religious or rural communities: social silence. When a community avoids confrontation in the name of empathy, the flow of informal information, observations, concerns, or small warnings can disappear. In missing child cases, those small details can be crucial: changes in attendance, mood, or family interactions that might have hinted at stress before a crisis. By choosing not to question or report, even unintentionally, potential witnesses withhold context that could clarify the timeline. In the Wells case, the church's culture of privacy created what might be described as a social data gap. No one within the congregation ever reported concerns about the family to authorities, and no member came forward with new information. After the disappearance, Robin's own testimony reflects this absence. She described the Wells family as sincere, loving, and here to worship. She saw no visible signs of conflict or distress when they attended services. To her and others, they appeared stable. That perception became the public narrative of their church life: orderly, normal, even wholesome. The line Robin used to describe their presence captures this perfectly. They came to worship. Not to ask for anything, it was meant as praise, but it also highlights how easily outer stability can mask inner tension. In sociological analysis, such statements illustrate how communities construct moral impressions. Images of families as pious or struggling, deserving or not. Once that impression sets, it filters perception. Church members who see a family as faithful are less likely to notice signs of trouble. Even if they do, they interpret them charitably. The collective silence wasn't intentional concealment, it was structural. The church valued discretion, the Wells family valued privacy, and together they formed an environment where information stayed contained. After Summer's disappearance, that containment remained. Robin became the informal spokesperson, not because others refused to talk, but because she was the only one willing to speak publicly at all. Her interviews, both compassionate and cautious, mirror the church's tone: empathetic, defensive, and careful not to assign blame. From an investigative viewpoint, this non-confrontational dynamic had measurable consequences. The lack of external reports meant that investigators had almost no community-based insight into the family's routines in the weeks before June 15th. There were no independent observations of Summer's behavior outside the home, no corroborating witness statements about her final appearances, and no contextual reports of parental stress or conflict. What remained was a vacuum of first-hand information, the kind that often helps investigators separate fact from rumor early on. In sociological terms, this is known as the closure of the social network, the point where a group's internal solidarity prevents external intervention. The church's instinct to protect its own members, combined with its emphasis on forgiveness and prayer, effectively sealed the Wells family off from scrutiny. No one asked invasive questions, and no one volunteered speculation. The result was a paradox: a faith community deeply involved in spirit but detached in function. Robin's leadership role amplified this effect. As both a teacher and a public voice, her statements carried authority. When she publicly affirmed the family's sincerity, others followed her lead. To the congregation, defending the Wells family became synonymous with defending the church's compassion. To investigators, that unity meant fewer independent voices willing to provide nuanced accounts of what they might have seen or heard before the disappearance. The prayer line, then, served two purposes. Spiritually, it bound the community together in shared hope. Practically, it replaced inquiry with intercession. "We just need to pray," Robin repeated. "God will bring her back in his time." In a tragedy defined by uncertainty, that faith offered comfort. But it also ensured that whatever insight might have existed within the church stayed unspoken, lost beneath good intentions. For investigators reconstructing the social landscape around the Wells family, Robin's description of that environment is crucial. It defines the cultural boundary between empathy and evidence, a line where prayer became the dominant response and silence became the unintentional cost. In the end, no one from the church provided new leads or contradicting statements. The congregation's love protected the family's dignity, but it also preserved the mystery. In the story of Summer Wells, that collective choice became one more form of silence, another missing piece in a case already defined by what no one saw and no one said. As the first chaotic night on Ben Hill Road turned into the following days, the investigation into Summer Wells' disappearance began to reveal not only the absence of physical evidence, but also the absence of coordinated information. In her interview with the Interview Room, Robin Lane described what it was like to stand at the intersection of those three worlds, the family, the police, and the public, and to realize that none of them were hearing the same story. Her words painted a picture not of secrecy, but of fragmentation. Everybody was trying, she said, but nobody seemed to have the same information. Robin's description aligns with what later became evident through official statements and media reporting. From the moment the 911 call was placed, the lines of communication between agencies, residents, and the family were not fully synchronized. The result was what investigators refer to as an information vacuum, a period when critical facts existed, but were not distributed evenly, causing confusion, duplication, and in some cases, distortion. 3 examples from Robin's own account illustrate how that vacuum formed and expanded. The first was the red truck rumor. Robin confirmed that by the time she gave her July 2021 interview, investigators had already ruled out the vehicle as relevant. Yet the public continued to treat it as an active lead well into late summer. The TBI's early press release, which asked anyone who had seen a red Toyota Tacoma in the Beach Creek area to come forward, lacked a follow-up correction for weeks. During that time, residents, amateur sleuths, and social media users flooded tip lines with photos and sightings of red trucks across Tennessee. This delayed correction consumed resources and shifted focus away from more actionable leads. The second disconnect involved the distribution of Summer's photo. Robin recalled arriving at the search site on the night of June 15th and finding that not all officers had seen the child's image. It took her own phone to provide the first visual confirmation for several responders. That gap in image dissemination demonstrates a breakdown in internal communication. The visual reference necessary for coordination wasn't uniformly available. For search teams working under time pressure, such inconsistency undermines efficiency. In procedural terms, it represents a communication failure within the first operational hour. The third and most persistent inconsistency centered on the timeline itself. The 911 call was logged at 6:30 p.m., yet Robin's record of multiple FaceTime attempts from Candus between 6:30 and 7 p.m. suggests overlap. Investigators have never publicly clarified whether those calls occurred before or after the emergency report. Without that clarification, every subsequent reconstruction of the evening remains vulnerable to error. These 3 gaps, muddled public communication, delayed photo distribution, and uncertain timing, formed a triad of distortion that shaped the early narrative. For investigators and analysts, this triad explains why the Summer Wells case, despite rapid mobilization, stalled almost immediately. The confusion wasn't merely due to lack of evidence, it was due to non-alignment of data channels. Agencies received partial information, the media amplified incomplete details, the public reacted to those fragments as fact. By the time corrections were issued, the initial version of the story had already solidified in public memory. Robin's position during those days placed her directly in the middle of this disconnect. As both a family contact and a trusted community figure, she became an informal conduit of information. She spoke with law enforcement officers, the Wells parents, and church members seeking updates. People would ask me what was going on, she said, and I didn't always know what to tell them, because what I heard wasn't always the same as what they heard. This statement underscores her unique role, a civilian unintentionally bridging 3 separate streams of communication that were rarely in sync. Her vantage point exposes how each side operated under its own understanding of events. Law enforcement was focused on the procedural timeline, the media prioritized continuous updates, and the public interpreted both through emotion and speculation. The absence of a single, authoritative narrative allowed misinformation to thrive. Online forums began producing independent reconstructions, some of which contradicted official statements. Meanwhile, the Wells family's occasional public appearances, fragmented interviews, Facebook posts, and YouTube live streams added more noise than clarity. The communication gap Robin described mirrors patterns seen in other rural missing child cases, where limited local infrastructure and overlapping jurisdictions create friction. Hawkins County Sheriff's Office, the TBI, and federal resources all participated in the search, but their channels of communication were not fully unified in the first 48 hours. Without centralized messaging, the public's role transformed from supportive to disruptive. Well-intentioned volunteers duplicated searches, contaminated possible tracks, and circulated false reports. The information vacuum was no longer just administrative, it became social. From a systems analysis viewpoint, these compounded errors demonstrate how investigative accuracy depends as much on information management as on evidence collection. The Wells investigation shows what happens when speed outpaces structure. The faster each group tried to act, the more disconnected their actions became. The consequence was a loss of control over the public narrative, a situation Robin indirectly documented through her testimony. Her recollections also highlight the psychological dimension of this vacuum. In environments saturated with uncertainty, people tend to substitute belief for data. Robin, operating from a place of faith, continued to focus on prayer and trust in the authorities. Others online filled the silence with speculation. Between those two poles, faith and rumor, the factual center eroded. That erosion is visible in the early press coverage, conflicting statements about where Summer was last seen, how long the family had been outside, and who was home at the time. For investigators reviewing the case today, Robin's testimony functions as a fixed reference point in a field of distortion. She observed the confusion firsthand, recognized the inconsistencies, and recorded them without embellishment. Her presence connects the three disconnected audiences: the Wells family's emotional narrative, the police's procedural account, and the community's reaction. In that sense, she became the only stable bridge between them. The significance of this information vacuum extends beyond the first week of the search. It influenced how every subsequent phase unfolded, how the public perceived guilt or innocence, how media framed updates, and how official statements were received. Once the initial narrative fractured, the investigation lost coherence in the public sphere. The facts became competing versions of the same story, each anchored to a different timeline. Robin Lane's quiet testimony doesn't solve that fracture, but it explains it. Through her account, the early chaos of the case can be understood not as secrecy or conspiracy, but as a failure of synchronization. The disappearance of Summer Wells didn't begin with missing evidence, it began with missing alignment. And by the time the system caught up, the damage to clarity had already been done. Nearly every major uncertainty in the Summer Wells case, the timeline, the evidence, and the credibility of early information, can be traced back to the first few hours of June 15, 2021, and few people outside law enforcement had a clearer view of those first hours than Robin Lane. Through her interview on The Interview Room, Robin provided not speculation but structure. She didn't name suspects, accuse anyone, or suggest theories. What she did offer was a series of verifiable data points that expose how the case began to lose coherence from the inside out. Each element of her testimony corresponds to a specific flaw in the early response. The FaceTime calls she received from Candus Bly around 6:30 to 7 p.m. revealed a potential timing conflict with the official 911 log. The photo she showed to police when she arrived on Ben Hill Road confirmed that search teams initially lacked a consistent image of the child. Her statement that the red truck had been eliminated clarified how outdated leads continued to circulate publicly. Even small details, the cool summer cut, haircut, or her confirmation that Don Wells had left and later returned home, served to verify or correct the fragments of rumor dominating public discussion. Taken together, these points form a factual framework for what could be called the chronology of confusion, the way real-time events, incomplete communication, and public dissemination collided in the first 48 hours to distort the investigation. The first correction Robin's account provides concerns time. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation recorded Candus's 911 call at 6:30 p.m. Robin's phone logs, if verified, place multiple FaceTime attempts from Candus within that same half hour. This overlap doesn't contradict the official timeline outright, but it complicates it. If the calls began before 6:30, it would suggest that Candus sought personal reassurance before reporting the disappearance to authorities. If they occurred after, it would show her seeking comfort after the formal report was made. Either version matters because it changes how investigators interpret the window between realization and action, the moment when panic became procedure. The second correction relates to communication and coordination. Robin's account that some officers at the scene had not seen Summers' photo demonstrates a procedural delay that likely affected the search's early precision. A missing photo means incomplete identification. Incomplete identification means wasted minutes, duplicated efforts, and reduced efficiency. In a terrain as difficult as the Beech Creek Hills, where darkness and distance close in quickly, even a small delay can erase vital traces. Robin's spontaneous decision to share her own photo filled that gap, but her description confirms the broader problem. Information that should have been centralized was instead fragmented among responders. The third major contribution concerns public misinformation. When Robin stated that the red Toyota Tacoma mentioned in early bulletins had already been ruled out, she inadvertently exposed how far behind public communication lagged. The TBI continued to repeat the description for weeks after internal investigators had dismissed it. This mismatch between what officials knew and what the public was told fed an ongoing wave of false leads. For investigators, Robin's testimony fixes the sequence. The red truck narrative outlasted its factual relevance because the correction arrived late. Other smaller but still significant clarifications from Robin's statements help stabilize the record. Her recollection of Summers' haircut around Mother's Day establishes the last, reliable photographic reference point for the child's appearance. Her acknowledgement that Don Wells had briefly left the property that afternoon, without implying wrongdoing, provides a verified element of family movement at a key time. Each of these details narrows uncertainty and removes conjecture. From a forensic analytical standpoint, Robin Lane's testimony operates as a secondary evidence stream, not of the event itself, but of the event's documentation. It tells investigators not only what was happening in the Wells family, but also what was happening to the information about them as it moved through institutions and into the public. This distinction is critical. She was not a witness to the disappearance, but a witness to how the response unfolded. The evidentiary value of such testimony lies in its capacity to expose systemic error. Every misaligned timestamp, every missing photograph, every outdated lead represents not a conspiracy, but a process failure. When law enforcement, media, and community networks operate on different timelines, truth splinters. Robin's recollections trace those fractures precisely to their origins. Investigators reconstructing a cold case often prioritize physical evidence, DNA, scent trails, digital logs. Yet procedural evidence, who knew what and when, is equally vital. Robin's details about the FaceTime window, the unshared photo, and the red truck's elimination provide markers for exactly where communication faltered. They help define not just the story of what happened to Summer, but the story of what happened to the investigation. Her role as both insider and outsider amplifies that value. As a church member close to the family, she was privy to emotional context others lacked. As a civilian with no investigative authority, her account is unfiltered by official narrative. She describes the gaps as they appeared in real time, before they were rationalized by press conferences or online debate. That perspective allows analysts to map the sequence of confusion without the bias of hindsight. From a macro perspective, Robin Lane's testimony transforms the case from a mystery of disappearance into a study of information disorder. The missing child is only part of the loss. The other missing element is coherence. Her words show that the case didn't simply go cold because evidence was scarce. It went cold because communication was inconsistent. By identifying where those inconsistencies began, Robin inadvertently provides a roadmap for investigators seeking to repair them. Her statements also carry legal and procedural implications. If the FaceTime records, phone metadata, or photo distribution logs can be corroborated. They establish objective timestamps that clarify when the first external awareness occurred, when the first visual identification was shared, and when the first misinformation began. These are not abstract corrections. They are potential anchors for reevaluating every early assumption about the case. Ultimately, what Robin's testimony reveals is not the identity of a perpetrator, but the anatomy of confusion. She demonstrates how an investigation can fracture not from lack of intent, but from lack of synchronization. Her recollections restore the order that the first hours lost, realigning facts in a sequence that finally makes sense. In that sense, Robin Lane stands as an unusual kind of witness, not to the crime, but to the collapse of clarity surrounding it. Her story does not tell us who took Summer Wells. It tells us how the truth itself began to disappear, and how, if the case is ever to be understood, investigators will need to start where she stood, at the intersection of every broken line of communication, holding a phone that still contained the details no one else had managed to connect.